In the decades before the American Civil War, the economy of the southern United States was an intricate and brutal machine, a system where the language of ledgers and account books was written in the ink of human suffering. At the heart of this system was a chillingly bureaucratic process, the valuation and sale of enslaved people. This was not a haphazard trade. It was a sophisticated market governed by detailed price schedules and commercial catalogs that reduced human beings to a list of physical attributes and economic potentials. The term slave catalog evokes not a single book, but a system of documentation, advertisements, bills of sale, and plantation records that collectively formed a ledger of human capital. The foundation of this market was the legal framework that defined enslaved Africans and their descendants as chattel property. This status was cemented by a series of laws known as slave codes, which were first fully articulated in the colony of South Carolina in the early 18th century, based on the 1661 Barbadian Slave Code. These laws systematically stripped away legal personhood, rendering an enslaved individual as a form of real estate in the eyes of the court. This legal fiction allowed for the creation of a massive insurance industry, where companies like the Baltimore Life Insurance Company and others openly insured the lives of enslaved workers for their owners, protecting the financial investment against the risk of death or disability. The process of valuation was a cold science. Potential buyers, often acting on behalf of plantation owners in the Deep South, would inspect enslaved individuals with the same clinical detachment used to appraise livestock. As one historian notes, slaves were measured, poked, and examined for defects exactly as animals were. Their teeth were checked for age, their muscles were felt for strength, and their backs were inspected for the scars that told a story of past punishment or resistance, a blemish that could lower their market value. This inspection was the first step in a process that would be finalized in the stark columns of a price schedule or the descriptive prose of a newspaper advertisement. The stage was set for a market that was as methodical as it was monstrous, where every human quality was assigned a price. The system of appraisal is a perfectly calibrated machine of dehumanization, but it is the written record, the catalog, and the price list that provides the most chilling insight into the minds of the slave traders. How did they translate the complexities of a human life into a simple set of marketable characteristics? And what can these documents tell us about the specific, calculated cruelty of the fancy trade and the valuation of women's reproductive capacity? To uncover the brutal logic of the slave catalog, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of this harrowing investigation.
The most explicit examples of the commodification of enslaved people are found in the surviving price schedules and auction catalogs. These documents are a stark blueprint of the slave trader's logic, outlining the precise monetary value assigned to age, sex, skill, and physical condition. A typical schedule, like those used in major slave trading hubs such as Richmond, Virginia, or New Orleans, Louisiana, would list prices in a clear tabular format. The categories were brutally simple. The primary determinant of price was age and sex. A prime field hand, a young man between the ages of 18 and 25, commanded the highest price, often valued at the equivalent of a modern sports car. His strength and longevity were his key assets. Similarly, a young, healthy woman was valued for her dual capacity for labor and reproduction. The schedules would then account for skill. An enslaved person with a specialized trade, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a cook, could be worth half again as much as a field hand. Their skills represented a greater return on investment for the purchaser. Perhaps the most telling categories were those describing physical and mental state. Terms like defective or unsound covered a range of conditions from physical disabilities like a missing limb or poor eyesight to chronic illnesses like epilepsy or consumption, tuberculosis. These individuals occupied the lowest price tier. But another category was even more sinister: troublesome or rebellious. An enslaved person who had attempted escape, who talked back to an overseer, or who showed any sign of intractability was marked as a risk. Their price would be discounted, not out of mercy, but because they represented a potential loss of productivity and a threat to plantation discipline. The price schedule was thus not merely a list of prices, it was a risk assessment tool, quantifying the potential for resistance as a financial liability. This cold calculus extended with particular cruelty to the valuation of women, whose wombs were assessed as a key component of their market worth. The price schedule is a stark map of the slave traders' values, where human capacity and suffering are assigned a dollar value. But to truly understand the human tragedy behind these numbers, one must look at the specific individual stories contained within the auction advertisements. How were living, breathing people described in the newspapers that served as the marketplace for human flesh? The language of these ads provides a window into the deepest horrors of the system, especially for women and children. To read the advertisements that tore families apart, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter. The public face of the slave catalog was the newspaper advertisement. In publications across the South, columns filled with notices for runaway slaves and upcoming auctions provided devastatingly intimate glimpse into the process of commodification. The language of these ads was a precise, brutal shorthand designed to quickly convey the assets of a human being to a potential buyer. The descriptions were a grotesque parody of a personals column, listing attributes without a soul. A typical advertisement would begin with a name, but this was often a name given by the enslaver, not a chosen identity. It would then list age, height, and skin complexion, using terms like black, brown, mulatto, or griff, a person of three-quarters African descent. This was not merely descriptive. In a society obsessed with racial hierarchy, the degree of African ancestry was a significant factor in valuation. The ad would then detail any notable skills: good seamstress, prime plow hand, excellent cook. These were the features that increased the asking price. The most heartbreaking ads are those that reveal the fragmentation of families. Notices for the sale of a woman and her 3 children, or more tragically, separate listings for a mother and her young offspring, are common. The language casually notes these relationships, acknowledging the bond only as a logistical detail. Some ads even promised that families would not be separated, using this as a selling point to suggest the good character of the enslaved individuals, or to appeal to a buyer's conscience, though such promises were often broken. For women, the advertisements often contained a more insidious subtext. Descriptors like good breeding woman with a fine child or likely young woman were code for reproductive value. A woman's ability to bear children who would themselves become the property of her owner was a tangible financial asset. This was the cold economic logic of slave breeding, a practice where women were explicitly valued for their wombs. The advertisement was the public face of a private hell, a document that celebrated the destruction of the most fundamental human bonds as a sound business practice. But for a select few, this commodification took on an even more grotesque and intimate form in the fancy trade. The newspaper advertisement reduces a human life to a list of saleable traits, a public announcement of private agony. But for a certain class of enslaver, the cataloging process was even more invasive, focusing on aesthetics, complexion, and perceived docility for a specific and degrading purpose. The fancy trade represented the pinnacle of this dehumanization, turning human beings into luxury items for the gratification of the wealthy. To enter the shadowy world of the New Orleans fancy girl markets, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
At the most extreme end of the slave catalog system was the fancy trade. This was a specialized market centered in cities like New Orleans, where light-skinned enslaved women and girls, often of mixed race, were sold for exorbitant prices as personal servants, status symbols, and concubines. The term fancy was a euphemism for sexual exploitation. These were not workers for the field. They were human commodities selected for their appearance, their manners, and their perceived compliance. The valuations in the fancy trade operated on a different scale. Where a prime field hand might sell for $1,000, a fancy girl could fetch $2,000, $3,000, or even $5,000, a colossal sum in the antebellum era. Their value was tied to the fantasy they represented for the white male buyers. Advertisements and traders' descriptions for these women emphasized traits completely divorced from labor: straight hair, fine features, fair complexion, graceful figure, and pleasing address. They were often dressed in fine clothing and taught genteel manners to enhance their appeal and price. The most chilling aspect of this trade was its sheer brazenness. It was not a hidden underworld. It was a public and accepted part of the economic landscape. Auction houses like those in New Orleans' St. Louis Hotel had specific times for these fancy auctions. The women were put on display, their bodies scrutinized by a crowd of wealthy men. The slave catalog in this context became a kind of twisted menu, offering human beings for sexual consumption under the guise of domestic service. This practice was the ultimate expression of the slaveholders' power. It demonstrated that not only could black people be owned as laborers, but their very bodies and identities could be reshaped to fulfill the most intimate desires of their oppressors. The children born from these unions, known as fancy babies, were themselves highly valued commodities, destined to be sold back into the same system. The fancy trade laid bare the profound lie at the heart of the slave system, that it was a benevolent, paternalistic institution. It was, in reality, a system that sanctioned and commercialized rape, turning human beings into the ultimate luxury good. Yet even within this meticulously documented system of control, the humanity of the cataloged could not be entirely extinguished. The fancy trade represents the most personalized and intimate form of dehumanization, where human beings are cataloged and priced for their aesthetic and sexual appeal. But the ledgers and price schedules tell only one side of the story. What was the experience of the men, women, and children who were subjected to this clinical appraisal? How did they resist the erasure of their identities? And what legacies did they build in the face of such profound oppression? The story within the ledger is one of unimaginable pain, but it is also a story of unyielding spirit. To discover the resistance and resilience that the catalogs could never record, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
While the slave catalog sought to define people by their market value, the enslaved themselves fiercely maintained their own identities, relationships, and inner lives that were completely invisible to the trader's eye. The system of appraisal and sale was designed to break the human spirit, but it often failed. The response from the enslaved population was a powerful, multifaceted resistance that ranged from subtle defiance to open rebellion.
One of the most common forms of resistance was self-harm. Knowing that a defect could lower their value and potentially deter a sale that would separate them from their family, some enslaved individuals would deliberately injure themselves. Others would feign illness or disability or pretend to be less intelligent or skilled than they were, a practice known as putting on old massa. This was a dangerous gamble, as it could lead to severe punishment, but it was a calculated act of sabotage against the market that sought to commodify them. When faced with the ultimate horror of family separation, some mothers took even more drastic measures. There are documented cases, heart-wrenching in their tragedy, of enslaved women who killed their own children to spare them a life of bondage or to prevent them from being sold away. This was not an act of malice, but one of devastating mercy and the ultimate assertion of a mother's control in a system that denied her any. These acts of desperation stand as the most profound indictment of the slave catalog's logic, a refusal to allow one's child to become an entry in a ledger. Beyond these desperate acts, enslaved people built resilient communities and preserved their cultural heritage. They held secret religious services, told stories that kept their African origins alive, and created families and kinship networks that provided love and support in the face of a system designed to destroy such bonds. The names they called each other in the quarters, the songs they sang in the fields, the prayers they whispered at night, these were the true records of their lives, a living catalog of humanity that the price schedules could never capture. This resilience would eventually find its expression in a growing abolitionist movement that used the slave traders' own tools against them. The enslaved resisted their commodification with every tool available, from feigned illness to the ultimate sacrifice. Their humanity persisted, a truth that the cold numbers of the price schedule could never erase. But as the 19th century wore on, a new force began to use these very documents, the catalogs, the advertisements, the insurance policies, as weapons in a moral and political war. How did abolitionists turn the slave traders' own paperwork into a powerful indictment of the entire system? The final battle over the meaning of these catalogs would be fought in the court of public opinion and on the battlefields of the Civil War. To see how the ledger was used to destroy the system it created, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the final chapter.
The end of the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 legally abolished chattel slavery. But the bureaucratic mindset that produced the slave catalogs did not simply vanish. The ledgers that had once quantified human beings for sale were closed, but their legacy persisted in new forms of oppression and in the long, difficult journey toward historical reckoning. In the immediate aftermath of emancipation, the first task for many freed people was the literal and symbolic search for their families. The information wanted columns that filled black-owned newspapers in the late 1860s and 1870s are a poignant and heartbreaking archive. These ads, placed by former slaves, sought any news of mothers, fathers, children, and spouses who had been sold away years or even decades earlier. They often contained the very descriptions once used in slave catalogs: height, complexion, scar on the cheek, but now repurposed for an act of love and reclamation, not sale. This was the human spirit reassembling itself from the fragments left by the auction block. The slave catalogs themselves, however, were not forgotten. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians, genealogists, and descendants of the enslaved have returned to these documents with a new purpose. Where slave traders saw inventory, researchers now see evidence of a crime against humanity. These ledgers have become indispensable for reconstructing the lives of individuals whose stories were otherwise erased. They are used to trace family lineages broken by slavery, to document the scale and brutality of the domestic slave trade, and to provide the irrefutable data needed to understand the economic foundations of American wealth. The language of commodification also evolved. The end of slavery saw the rise of convict leasing, a system where Southern states arrested black people on minor or fabricated charges and then leased them out to private companies, such as coal mines and plantations, to work under conditions often worse than slavery. The meticulous records kept by these companies, detailing the cost of leasing a convict and the fines imposed for laziness, are a direct descendant of the slave catalog, applying the same brutal logic of human cost-benefit analysis to a new system of control. Today, the slave catalog stands as one of the most powerful pieces of evidence against the myth of the benevolent South. It is a cold, hard record of a system that could discuss the tear of a mother from her child in the same tone as the sale of a bushel of corn. These documents are now preserved in museums and archives, not as models of business practice, but as solemn reminders of a past that must never be repeated. They teach us that the greatest evils are often administered not in a frenzy of rage, but through the calm, orderly, and meticulous work of a bureaucrat with a pen. The price schedule is a permanent testament to the fact that when humanity is reduced to a number, the result is an atrocity. The story of the slave catalogs is a journey into the heart of a system that attempted to replace the human soul with a price tag. It is a tale that challenges our faith in bureaucracy and forces us to confront the darkest potentials of capitalism and racism. If you were drawn to the deepest and most dramatic stories of history, to the moments where the struggle for human dignity confronts the machinery of oppression, then your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are always exploring the darkest corners of history and the human experience.